Hey folks, with the video you're about to see, I want you to know that this was already pre-recorded and ready to go live. And we did have an, I'm going to say, alleged ban list released sometime in the last 24 hours. And I am aware of that. However, there are two things. One, I will not be linking to or referencing that in this video, partially because there are some things that make it a bit suspect and some inconsistencies in it. And as of the time of me recording this extra recording, we actually haven't been able to verify the source. And also, I don't want to share information around that could otherwise be inaccurate. And I also want to say that I'm going to ask that you please do not share or link that in the comments. We will also be following those and deleting those and or blocking people who do so. But I will say, I think that this video, we still discuss individual cards. We talk about some things that were not referenced in that questionable post. So I think the video still has some merit. But y'all let me know down in the comments after you watch the video how you feel about it. There are things that should or shouldn't be included, or do you even like this style of video? With that being said, thanks, and please enjoy the video. Alright, what's up, Dragon Brood? For those of you that don't know, Wizards of the Coast has announced that we're going to be getting yearly bans in the fall, now that we're moving to this 3-year standard rotation thing, which is actually kind of nice to at least know when they're coming. However, they did say on May 29th, coming up a week from now, that they're going to have some type of other banning in anticipation of the Wilds of Eldraine, which comes out later this fall. And it got me thinking, like, what card should be on the list? But before I get to what cards I think are probably going to be on the list, let's talk about some ideas of what should be on the list. Like, because one of the big problems we have with bannings is that ultimately players spend a bunch of money and then have those cards taken away from them. And that's always a feel bad, right? So maybe we should be focusing on cards that have like a 2-year already existing life in standard. So if they've been around a bit, you don't feel as bad if they go away because you got your money worth out of them. Or maybe, if possible, we try to keep it more to commons or uncommons that may be a problem if we think it can still help solve the problem. Now, the other part of that is you just sometimes get rares and mythics that are just problematic and you're not going to be able to avoid it. So let's talk about the cards that we think are probably going to be on this list. Now, first off, I think we all agree that Fable of the Mirror Breaker is the best card in standard in a lot of ways, and for sure the best red card, and it shows up in a lot of decks. I mean, I'm even guilty of it here on the channel. I've played a ton of different decks that have red, and a big chunk of them, outside of probably like hyper aggro Gruul or mono red aggro, are probably playing Fable of the Mirror Breaker. So it tells you how over the top the card is. Probably going to be on the list. Mostly because it just allows for a lot, right? It's a key part for the Reanimator decks. It's good for the mid-rangey decks. The Rakdos mid-range, definitely love that card. It lets you get quickly up to being able to cast Invoke Despair, which that's a card we'll talk about in a second. So like, it does a lot of different things. And would the format be hurt if this card didn't exist? I don't believe so. I think the decks that play it would still exist, they just wouldn't be as crazy. And we do have other cards that still put things in the graveyard, right? So even for those lists, it doesn't matter greatly because we have other options. So yeah, I think we could move that one on and not be hurt too badly. Another one that shows up a lot, and I'm not sure how I feel about, I've seen Reckoner Bankbuster on a lot of people's lists. And this one's a little more difficult for me because on the one hand, Bankbuster is a universally good card. It fits a lot of mid-range and control decks. But at the same time, I don't know if it's too bad if this card exists. Like, is it a lot of value? Absolutely. The fact that it even makes an extra creature down the line after you've gotten 3 cards is a little bit silly. But I don't know if it's busted enough that it needs to hit a ban list. So this one, I'm willing to give a pass to. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Invoke Despair. This one's a little bit tougher because I feel like this is a card a lot of people could have invested money in potentially. But at least if they do it now, we're not really going through the summer with everybody buying a bunch of standard cards, because this card would definitely be on the list. So I think if you nip it in the bud now, you save the paper players a bunch of mental anguish and financial anguish, I guess, from going out and purchasing this. So I'm on board with this one being on there, and I feel like it's also allowed 2 things to happen. One, that Black gets the ability to remove some cards that otherwise has difficulty removing, but it also puts a little bit of a strain on the control decks, right? Because it's also an easy way to get rid of a Planeswalker. So it's sort of eliminated a section of decks outside of the most hardcore of control options. So I'm kind of okay with this card going. I mean, and the card's good enough that we've seen black-green, black-red, black, like whatever. With so many multi-lands, it's actually not that hard to cast it in a 2-color for sure, and sometimes even 3-color deck. Now, with that, a lot of times you would see Shieldred. This creates an interesting conversation, right? So a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing in a way, but if Invoke Despair doesn't exist, do we care about Shieldred all that much? Like, don't get me wrong, Shieldred is a little bit of a problem, and it is very well statted for 4 mana. But if you're not ultimately drawing a bunch of extra cards, and you're not doubly punishing the opponent with loss of life from something like Invoke Despair, that would probably leave something like, I don't know, Corrupt possibly. If that's it, do we really mind? Like, the card's still really good, but I don't think it moves to ban worthy at that point. So I'm willing to give Shieldred a pass. But then there's the Harvester. This is another interesting one. And I don't know how I feel, right? Because I'm not a fan of having a bajillion things, which we already have a ton in the format, that get around indestructibility. Because it's kind of one of the only things creature decks can try to have these days to stay alive. Now, again, it doesn't do anything to hexproof or whatever, and that's still a thing. And if we get rid of the Fable of the Mirror Breaker, we're not copying this as often. So while I don't necessarily like having the card around, we've played against it forever in a pile of different decks, I do like the idea that it still exists with other vampires coming around, because we know, I believe, beginning of next year, we're going to be going back to Ixalan. So that's probably okay with me. I don't know. I say it gets a pass. And let's bring in another color to this argument for a second. How about Wedding Announcement? I bring this up because one of the popular conversations has been, well, if we get rid of all these things for black or black-red decks that seem to be dominating the format, then some variant of things with Wedding Announcement become the most dominant decks. And I don't know if that's totally true, but I at least can see the logic where that would come from. And Wedding Announcement is a lot of value. It's 3 creatures and or cards, and also gives you all your creatures +1/+1. And combine that with other things like Invasion of Gobakhan, it could get a little bit crazy. But we also haven't had a world where creature decks have had the upper hand at all. So do I care that much? Not terribly. But if it just leads to another section of just mono white mid-range or green white mid-range or something like that, just dominating, we probably want to avoid it. And to be honest, we've all kind of played with Wedding Announcement quite a bit. So if people feel that big about it, I can get on board. I don't know. This one's what I'm on the fence on. But hey, if enough people are against it, Wedding Announcement, you can have the boot. Oh, here's one. What about Cutdown? Now, this is one that looks kind of inconspicuous in a way. But one of the things I think we've learned about Cutdown over the last few months is that it actually makes it hard to play some decks, right? Because the creature decks almost get no real value or no expected value out of anything on turns 1 and 2 particularly, but sometimes even turn 3. Because think about the fact that there are a decent amount of things that cost 3 that happen to be 1/3s, 1/4s, 2/3s that you just can't play right now. I mean, you can, but you end up just being so far behind by the time you get anything else. And a lot of times, cards like that tend to be additives for other decks. Like right now, if you wanted to play some type of aggro deck with Reckless Stormseeker as an example, it's just a bad card right now, just because of something like Cutdown. Now, I'm not saying you just never play the card, but having a 1-mana answer to a turn 3 card is really tough on a lot of decks, especially with the other spot removal that seems to exist right now in the format. So I'm okay if we ended up putting Cutdown on the list. That'd be kind of a wild one, but I'm kind of okay with it. All right, and being real, if I have to make a personal grievance of something I want on the list, can we put Farewell on there? I mean, we already have to deal with Depopulate and Sunfall and whatever. Like, Farewell just feels so bad. Like, it deals with everything, including the graveyard. Like, it wipes out everything else. Like, it just, for 6 mana, it's just so much value. And it feels so unrestrictive for the power of such a card. So, I'm okay if this ends up on the list too. You wouldn't have to talk me into it very difficult. yeah, I'm not really into it. I'm okay with that card not existing either. So yeah, farewell, you can have the boot. Now, by and large, is this every single card that annoys every player? No, because you ask somebody, they're probably going to say something like, I don't know, the Wandering Emperor probably needs to be on the list. I don't think it does though, but I'm sure somebody feels like that's the case. But let's be honest, even if we got just those few cards out of the format, it would probably open up quite a bit. You end up with a larger variety of aggro decks, you definitely open up the world a little bit for some control decks to operate, and that sort of rebalances things a bit. And then we get to see what the summer looks like before we get to the fall, where they've already said there's now going to be a yearly fall banning as well, in place of having what would normally be the 2-year rotation. And I think this would be a good way to kind of like test that, see if these bannings work, and set things up for a nice release in the fall. So yeah, if nothing else, it's at least going to make summer a lot more interesting while we try to make content in standard. But let me know how you feel about this. I'm sure there's a card I forgot about, didn't mention that you want on the list. And yeah, how do you feel about bannings as a whole? But otherwise, that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.